Well, it's great to be able to join you for this important conference put on by the Asia Society Northern California. And I commend the chair, Gary Reichel, for his leadership of Asia Society over there on the Pacific West Coast, together with Margaret, the very able executive director of our center in San Francisco. The conference topic that I've been set is US-China relations moving to the edge. So let me address this in 3 or 4 quite specific ways. One, let's try and understand carefully, as of early 2023, what the essential elements of China's continuing strategy towards the United States is. Secondly, how do we best characterize US strategy towards China? Thirdly, to what extent has the Xi Jinping-Biden summit of November 2022 changed course as far as the management of the relationship is concerned? And finally, on the ground, what's still happening between the various countries' militaries? So on the first of these questions, let me touch briefly on Chinese grand strategy. Essentially, when China looks at the United States, it is seeking to do 2 or 3 things within its overall strategic remit. One, to maintain its own domestic political stability. Hard to do in a country as big as China, but look, for example, at the recent challenges in executing a huge policy U-turn on zero COVID, all to maintain domestic political stability because the economy was slowing radically and per capita income was therefore not growing as it had in the past, thereby threatening the social contract. The second element of China's grand strategy, like the first, is continue to grow the economy as the long-term national underpinnings of China's military and strategic capabilities. And that, of course, builds on decades of double-digit growth under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, but slowing growth now under Xi Jinping, something which he has sought to redress if we look carefully at the text of the Central Economic Work Conference of late December 2022, where new priority and a new premium has been placed on the absolute centrality of restoring growth to somewhere between 4 and 5% for 2023, that number having collapsed to well below 2 or 3 during 2022, and by some estimates, 0 to 1. The third element of Chinese grand strategy towards the United States and its allies is to adopt and embrace a more assertive foreign and security policy with the objective of pushing the United States and its allies back over time, but furthermore, at a more fundamental level of psychology, to cause the United States and its allies to conclude that standing against the overwhelming strategic and economic force of a rising China is a hopeless task, particularly on questions where the territorial interests of each side intersects, whether it's on Taiwan, the East China Sea, or the South China Sea. So in a nutshell, that's where China's grand strategy continues to go. So what about US grand strategy? Well, since 2017, when National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster adopted the phrase strategic competition, the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, have essentially adopted a bipartisan script. Secretary of State Blinken encapsulates it as follows: that for the United States and its grand strategy to prevail in its new competitive relationship against China, it should do 3 things. It should invest in American national capabilities, ranging from its science, its technology, through to its infrastructure, and of course, its military. Secondly, beyond that, to ally, or more effectively ally, and to rebuild the alliances which came under such pressure during the Trump administration, and whether those allies are in Europe or in Asia, to in fact adopt a pan-allied China strategy, which we now see being rolled out in categories such as the future of semiconductor exports from the United States and its principal allies to China. And of course, the third element of US grand strategy towards China is to actively compete. And by actively compete, I mean whenever China ceases to apply pressure, that the United States is there pushing in the reverse direction. That, of course, is a military equation, it's an economic equation, it's a trade equation, it's an investment equation, and most critically, it's a technology equation. And that is what the United States has been seeking to do, in particular, since the election of the Biden administration. The next question I thought I should touch on in these remarks is, so if they're the two sets of grand strategies at work against each other, with the ultimate prize being which country emerges as the preeminent regional and global power as we move towards mid-century, then what, if anything, has been achieved by the most recent summit between Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden? This, of course, was held in Bali in November of 2022. Up until now, at least for the last 5 years, the US-China relationship has been characterized by what I call unmanaged strategic competition. In other words, very few rules of the road remaining. So we had a daily exercise of push and shove in the contested geopolitical spaces of the Taiwan Straits, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, but also in other domains, including cyber and space as well. However, as of the November 2022 summit in Bali, we begin to see the emergence of the possibility of a combined embrace of new forms of managed strategic competition. Certainly, the Americans are now speaking in terms of the need to manage the competitive relationship, of the need to impose certain strategic guardrails around certain strategic red lines in the relationship. And while the Chinese don't use those terms, Xi Jinping, in his readout from the Bali summit, has also now begun to speak of the need for a series of new protections to be put in and around the relationship. And on top of that, to ensure that there is a national security safety net underneath the relationship. These are new linguistic formulations by Xi Jinping. Now, we might say, what does it matter what language these leaders use? Because ultimately, it's what the two militaries, the two economies, and the two technology systems actually do on the ground that matters. Well, the reality is this, that the language used by the two leaders does affect the direct behavior of those beneath them. And in China's case, for his officials to hear new language surrounding the need to put protections around the relationship and to build in a new form of security safety net underneath the relationship, authorizes his most senior military and diplomatic officials to begin constructing some rules of the road, some guardrails around Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, cyber and space. Will this work or not? We don't know yet, but we do know that a meeting is scheduled in Beijing with Secretary of State Blinken in February, that's only next month, to begin to look at how this might be operationalized at a level of continuing strategic communication between the two sides. This represents an on-balance improvement of where we have been in the last couple of years, where at times there was actually virtually no communication at all. And as for the Chinese side, Chinese ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang, has now returned to Beijing to become China's new foreign minister, therefore a minister with active and on-the-ground experience of this Biden administration and who knows Secretary of State Blinken particularly well. So we should suspend judgment until January and February as to whether this is going to achieve real progress. The fourth thing I said I'd touch on is, well, that's all fine and dandy, but what's actually happening on the ground now? Well, at a level of technology, of course, the race is still on in earnest. The United States is leveraging its allies to come in support of its 7 October statement, which outlined a whole series of new technology export bans towards China, most particularly in the area of semiconductors. And if we're to believe in the reporting from within inside the Beltway, this is likely to be expanded to include quantum computing and artificial intelligence in the year ahead. In other words, the United States appears to be prosecuting a strategy of a high level of technological decoupling. Will it succeed in containing China's technological rise? open question, but that is what is happening on the ground, and with reluctant but so far increasing support from US allies, most particularly the Dutch, the Taiwanese, the Koreans, and the Japanese. On the military question, I think we need to put in a very sobering concluding remark. And that is, when we look across what's actually happening on the ground, the level of mid-air incidents between China and the United States continues to be of concern. Most recently, we saw evidence of aircraft, both American and Chinese, coming within some 10 feet of each other in mid-air maneuvers. This is deeply destabilizing. It is simply one crash away, one collision away from a crisis, which then would have to be managed. If we look carefully at what's happening in the East China Sea and the number of sorties being flown by the Japanese self-defense force against their Chinese challengers in and around Sankoku, Diaoyudao, and across the East China Sea, this continues to maintain its intensity and pace. Of course, beyond that as well, we see increasing evidence that China is engaged in joint military maneuvers, exercises, I won't say operations, with the Russian Far East Fleet and with other Russian forces in the Russian Far East. Of course, from China's perspective, this helps China increase its level of war preparedness. And there's been further reporting that elsewhere, namely in the Indian Ocean, we see combined operations and maneuvers between Chinese, Iranian, and Russian naval units as well. And so while we may talk about managed strategic competition, we may talk about, therefore, these upcoming meetings in Beijing to look at new guardrails to prevent or reduce the risk of military incidents from occurring and from crisis, escalation, conflict, and war from ensuing. The reality is, in the last several weeks, the pace of activity continues, and frankly, the intensity of that military activity seems to be on the increase. Therefore, we need to look very carefully at what practical results ensue from the meeting in February. To conclude, the real race that is now on between China and the United States is between China and US allies. China is saying to American allies in Europe and in Asia, our markets are opening again. Your foreign direct investment continues to be welcome. We are a huge product market and service market, too huge for you to ignore, and do not respond, therefore, to American entreaties to join an impending and unfolding economic decoupling with the People's Republic of China. So China's strategy is very much directed towards a broadening charm offensive towards US allies, friends, and partners in Asia and in Europe. What is the United States doing? Well, continuing to develop its Indo-Pacific strategy, continuing to deepen its NATO collaboration with its European partners in relation to Russia, but building in more robust postures on China, both within NATO frameworks and more broadly in the European Union as well. And similarly, in its bilateral treaty relationships in East Asia. What will the future hold? I think it ultimately hangs still on the economy. Will China represent a bigger economic lure to America's strategic aspirations to remain the dominant power? Or will the United States continue to reinvent itself economically and technologically, continue to grow, and increasingly throw open its doors to become an equally attractive market for allies, friends, and partners around the world? At present, that's the missing piece in American grand strategy. I congratulate you again on convening this conference, and I look forward to hearing of your deliberations when Margaret and Gary speak to me about its outcomes later on.